Marcus Alden spent 40 years behind a camera, and in all that time, people knew him as the gentlest man in the business. Actors trusted him. Crews adored him. Journalists called him the conscience of Hollywood. But when a young film student asked him, at what was supposed to be a routine retrospective screening, what the old studio era was really like, something shifted in his face. He set down his coffee cup, looked at the audience for a long moment, and said, "You want the truth? The truth is uglier than any movie we ever made." What followed was not the nostalgic trip down memory lane the crowd expected. It was a confession. 6 names, 6 stories, 6 ghosts that had followed Marcus Alden through a lifetime in the industry he loved and feared in equal measure. This is that story. To Alden, the so-called golden age of cinema was less a golden age than a gilded one, beautiful on the surface, rotten underneath. "We talk about the movies," he said, "but we never talk about the men and women who made them and what it cost the people around them." Over the following 2 hours, he named names. Not out of bitterness, he insisted, but out of obligation. Someone has to say it before all of us who remember are gone. The first name out of Alden's mouth was Vincent Callaway, the swashbuckling leading man whose face had graced 100 posters throughout the 1930s and 40s. Callaway was, by every account, magnetic. Audiences adored his rakish grin, his effortless charisma, the sense that he might leap off the screen and sweep you away on some grand adventure. Alden remembered watching Callaway's films as a boy and idolizing him the way other kids idolized ballplayers. But the Callaway that Alden encountered years later, as a young assistant director on a studio backlot, bore little resemblance to the hero on screen. He treated the crew like furniture, Alden recalled. If you weren't useful to him in that exact moment, you didn't exist. Worse, according to Alden, were the persistent rumors that followed Callaway from picture to picture. Whispers about his conduct toward young women who worked as extras and assistants, women with far less power than he had, who had far more to lose by speaking up. Nothing ever stuck to him, Alden said. The studio made sure of that. They had lawyers whose only job, it seemed, was cleaning up after him. Callaway's decline, when it came, was slow and public. Years of heavy drinking eroded the charm that had once made him a star. By the time he made his final picture, directors were reportedly filming around his shaking hands and glassy stare, propping him up between takes. He died relatively young, and the studio-approved obituaries spoke of a tragic loss and a legend gone too soon. Alden had a different epitaph in mind. He wasn't tragic, he said. He was protected. There's a difference. If Callaway represented charm weaponized, Eleanor Vance represented something colder. In Alden's telling, cruelty dressed up as perfectionism. Vance was one of the most acclaimed actresses of a generation, a woman whose icy elegance made her a fixture of prestige pictures for 2 decades. Critics praised her precision, her control, her ability to dominate a scene with a single glance. That same need for control, Alden said, made her a nightmare to work alongside. She didn't direct her scene partners. She terrorized them. He recalled crew members who dreaded her arrival on set each morning, uncertain whether she would be gracious or explosive, and unable to predict which version of her they'd get. Makeup artists reportedly kept a mental list of subjects to avoid discussing, having learned the hard way which topics could trigger an outburst. One story, retold so often on studio lots that Alden said it had become something of dark legend, involved Vance halting production for an entire afternoon because she felt a supporting actress's dress was distracting from her own. Her reputation eventually caught up with her. By the later years of her career, according to Alden, directors began quietly declining to work with her, and the offers slowed to a trickle. She spent her final years largely out of the public eye, occasionally resurfacing for an interview in which she blamed the industry for abandoning her rather than reflecting on what had driven people away. She chased perfection so hard, Alden said, that she forgot there were people standing next to her the whole time. Few stars of the era loomed as large in the public imagination as Walt Bishop, the square-jawed cowboy whose pictures defined an entire vision of American masculinity for a generation of moviegoers. Bishop wasn't just an actor to millions of fans. He was a symbol, an idea of the country itself, rugged and unshakable. Alden, who grew up watching Bishop's westerns, admitted that learning the truth about the man behind the myth was one of the most disillusioning experiences of his career. He ruled his sets through fear, Alden said. If a crew member made a mistake, Bishop wouldn't just correct them. He'd humiliate them in front of everyone, make an example out of them. Alden recalled colleagues describing a kind of collective anxiety that settled over any production Bishop was attached to, a sense that one wrong move could end a career. Beyond the sets, Alden said, Bishop was known for his combative and often bigoted public statements, comments that in later decades will be recognized as deeply prejudiced but that, at the time, were largely shrugged off by an industry unwilling to challenge one of its biggest stars. People confused stubbornness for strength, Alden said. They confused cruelty for conviction. He wasn't defending anything noble. He was just used to getting his way, and he dressed it up as principle. Bishop worked well into his final years, never softening, never apologizing, dismissing his critics as products of a culture he didn't recognize and didn't respect. He died still widely celebrated as an icon. Alden's assessment was less generous. The myths survived him, he said, but the man underneath it never deserved the legend they built. Of all 6 names Alden mentioned that evening, none seemed to weigh on him more heavily than Julian Rourke. Rourke was, by nearly universal critical consensus, one of the most gifted directors of his generation, a filmmaker whose work turned psychological dread into something like art. Alden had studied Rourke's films in school, dissected his technique frame by frame, and considered him, for a time, a hero. That admiration collapsed entirely when the truth about Rourke's conduct toward a minor came to light, an act so serious that Rourke fled the country rather than face sentencing, spending the rest of his life and career in self-imposed exile, working from abroad, always just outside the reach of the justice system he had evaded. I admired his films before I knew who he really was, Alden said. Then I understood that talent doesn't erase what someone's done. Sometimes it just gives them a place to hide. What troubled Alden most wasn't Rourke's crime alone, but the industry's response to it. Rourke continued to work, continued to be celebrated, even received a major award decades later while still a fugitive from the law, an honor that drew a standing ovation from an audience that, in Alden's telling, chose to separate the artist from a man. I didn't stand, Alden said quietly of that night. I thought about the harm that was done and I couldn't make myself do it. For Alden, Rourke's story became a symbol of everything he found most troubling about the industry's relationship to genius, an unwillingness to hold brilliant people accountable, so long as their work kept the lights on. Bobby Finnick had been, in his day, the most beloved child star in the country, a grinning, singing, dancing prodigy who carried entire studio musicals on his small shoulders before he was even a teenager. To audiences, he represented pure, uncomplicated joy. Alden remembered watching Finnick's old pictures on television as a kid and feeling, for 90 minutes at a time, that the world was a simpler, happier place. The adult Finnick, however, was a far more complicated figure. Fame at such a young age, Alden said, seemed to warp something in him permanently. He burned through marriages and fortunes with equal speed, developed a reputation as unpredictable and difficult, and, according to people who worked alongside him, could be devastating to those closest to him, capable of tremendous warmth one moment and casual cruelty the next. In his later years, family members reportedly took advantage of his declining finances and isolation, a sad coda to a life that had started with the whole world watching and ended in near obscurity. He made audiences laugh for decades, Alden reflected. But from what people close to him described, that same performance came at a cost to the people in his life, and eventually to himself. Finnick died with far less than his fame might have suggested, a quiet ending for a man who had once been the most famous child in America. For Alden, his story was less about villainy than about what unchecked fame, without guidance or accountability, could do to a person, and what that person, in turn, could do to everyone around him. Pain doesn't disappear just because you're smiling for a camera, Alden said. Sometimes it just gets passed along. Alden saved his final story for last, and it was, in some ways, the most unsettling of all, because he refused to name the person at its center. I could tell you who it was, he said, but I think the story means more if you don't get to decide it's someone else's problem. The sixth figure, in Alden's telling, was a producer, not an actor, not a face on a poster, but someone who worked entirely behind the scenes, controlling careers, green-lighting pictures, and deciding, with a word, who would work in this town again and who would quietly disappear from it. Everyone in the business at the time knew what he was, Alden said. Nobody said anything, because everyone needed something from him. The producer's alleged conduct, per Alden's account, ranged from financial exploitation of vulnerable young performers to a pattern of psychological manipulation that left lasting damage on people who never became famous enough for anyone to ask about them later. The actors you've heard of are only half the story, Alden said. For every name people still remember, there were a dozen people this man destroyed who never got the chance to become anybody at all. Alden's refusal to name him wasn't, he insisted, an act of protection. It was a challenge. I want you to understand that this isn't ancient history, he said. This is still happening, in some form, right now, to somebody. If you're waiting for me to give you a villain with a face so you can feel like the problem's been solved, I'm not going to do that for you. By the end of the evening, the mood in the room had shifted entirely from nostalgic reverence to something heavier. Alden closed with a reflection that, in his words, had taken him decades to arrive at. We tell ourselves the golden age was golden because the movies were beautiful, he said. But beauty on screen doesn't mean anything about what happened off it. If anything, I think the beauty made it easier to look away.